Women of Wyoming Then and Now is brought to you by the Wyoming Historical Society and supported in part by a grant from the Wyoming Cultural Trust Fund, a program of the Department of State Parks and Cultural Resources. This program features unique female perspectives on events, themes, or narratives related to state history. We, the host, believe that one woman's action toward a better future can result in a greater legacy that inspires and equips many generations of women to come. Welcome everyone to Women of Wyoming Then and Now. I'm today's host, Janelle Maloney, an author and historian, and with me as a co-host is Linda Fabian.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Audrey. It's so nice to see you. I'm Linda Fabian, former director of the Wyoming Historical Society, lay historian and author.
Oh, nice to see you both.
Thank you.
And our very special guest today is Audrey Cotherman, who is also a historian and author. And she actually has a new book out from 2017 called A Pinch of Salt, in which she talks about the human condition and how we've either flopped or succeeded in our Wyoming endeavors. So I would encourage everyone to take a look at that.
Thank you.
Audrey, can you tell us more about starting with the Wyoming Humanities Council way back in 1973?
Oh, that's a pleasure. It was one of the best jobs I ever had. And we were contacted by the National Endowment for the Humanities and one of the first states to get a state-based program going. And they hired me as executive director in 73. It had a board of directors, of course, of people around Wyoming. Some of them with the community colleges, some of them just citizens in the community. And so the challenge was, well, let me put it this way. My mother, when I graduated, got my undergraduate degree in English, said, "Oh, that's nice, honey, but what can you do?" And the challenge was always, how can we convince people or demonstrate to people that those studies, English, philosophy, history, were relevant to our lives? And so that was kind of the challenge at the time. And so we launched that program. We held public meetings, usually planned by people in the community. We didn't just say, "Here's a program, you want to hear it." We got people involved in the community, and at first we probably did some kind of weird things. I think we had a philosopher talking about the water system over in Rock Springs or something. And then the first snag we hit where people were wondered about it, some people did, is we funded horror films. Well, those films had a lot to do with economic differences among people, cultural differences, history, and so on. But they thought, why in the world would you spend public money on horror films? But actually, as the people who participated in it began to speak up about what they discussed, the criticism kind of faded away. But naturally, if you concentrated on the history in Wyoming, people understood that better. The literature in Wyoming, we had some really good stuff. Peggy Simpson Curry and other people Tom Ray talking about Wyoming, and I'm sure there were others, but I knew those two people very well, and so that's kind of a background about the humanities conference.
Just to clarify, you were the first director, but also a woman being the first director is a really neat feather in your cap.
Well, Hilton Power was at the university at the time, and he had gathered and he had contact with the National Endowment, and Hilton had, I mean, he was one of those wonderful, bright, compassionate men who had not a speck of prejudice about women, and so he and these people they'd gather on the board selected me to do that job.
Well, we think that what you've done through establishing all of those procedures and a legacy of making sure, like you said, we have representation and understanding of our human experiences. We think that's wonderful. But can you tell us now, or for our viewers, what you've been doing since then that will impact future perspectives on Wyoming history?
I mean, we're talking 40 years here.
You've done a lot since then. I understand that at some point you started or were an editor for a newspaper in Du Bois.
That's true. I did publish that little newspaper in Du Bois, and that was quite an experience because the lumber company moved out, and then there were the fires in Yellowstone. So that newspaper, it was kind of a financial disaster, let's put it that way, because the advertising disappeared with those two events that happened. I would think that the impact, if any, you understand that any impact any of us had was working with other women and men. So you can't say, here's what I accomplished, because you didn't accomplish much of anything if you didn't learn to work with other people. And I thought if I had any impact at all is because I firmly believed in community and contributing to community and staying involved in things. And so I took that job with the State Department of Education as the Deputy State Superintendent. And of course, the superintendent at the time, Lynn Simons, was also a woman. And there were some people in the department itself that weren't sure they wanted two women in charge of things.
Strong women.
Right. And Lynn Simons, of course, a very, very bright woman, and of course she was one of five officials on those state boards, five state boards. So your deputy was kind of in charge of seeing that the department itself functioned. And some people, I tried to tell myself that it wasn't because we were women. That's not true. It was because sometimes people perceive you have more power than you actually do. And they thought that position was a power position, and it was occupied by a woman that was, well, I never was a shy woman. And if there's any power to anything, it's to be used to accomplish something good. You have to work with other people. And that was part of, I hope, the tradition in the department that we established.
That reminds me, we had spoken earlier about getting active in that later stage of life. And now things are a little different as you mature, but you still have the expertise and the experience and this wealth of wisdom to contribute. Also financially and with your time, you have a wealth to contribute back. So I understand you want us to keep being involved and keep speaking out, no matter what age we are.
Well, that's true. I can't see just sitting in your rocking chair. And so, when I was 88, I ran for the legislature, knowing full well that I didn't have a chance. But it was great fun. I walked about 100 miles door to door, and mostly it was just a ball talking to people. By the way, when you talk about women, thank goodness there were wonderful males along the way that, one of the things I'm proudest of is in those years between, I didn't work right away. I didn't work until I was about 45. I had 4 children. I had I think it's, as I look back, an advantage here of being involved in my community because I had the children and I wasn't working. So I did PTA and League of Women Voters and so on. The League was quite a powerhouse in those days. We studied things objectively, and legislators actually counted on us to bring them facts. And one year they voted that we were they thought we were the best or the most effective lobbying group because they didn't think we came in with a kind of a biased agenda and so on. So those were wonderful years too. Also, I do teach an Ollie. They call them Ollie, a course
writing course
at the college.
Yeah,
and that's been a ball. I've done that. I lost track, but maybe 6-7 years. A lot of the same people. See, they're trying to do their memoirs, and I really encourage that. And also, you'd appreciate this. I say, don't just say I was born and then and then and then. Put it into cultural context. What was happening historically? What was happening at the time that influenced your life?
Exactly.
Audrey, I really appreciate how you get your students and for our viewers today to think about their life and their life's impact in that social and historical context. I think sometimes, especially for the younger generations, we don't realize that we are living in history and that what we do right now is making history and matters. So when you encourage your students to frame their experience in that bigger picture, you actually add more value and more meaning to our own personal lives that maybe we had just sort of taken for granted.
So, Audrey, I have a question. Who do you credit? I mean, where did you get your spirit? How were you encouraged to blossom? And how were you encouraged to develop your own ideas?
Oh, that's a profound question. I don't know. I have a couple stories of, I guess, my father bought me a baseball glove and he'd throw that ball at me faster and harder. I was about 10, 12 at the time. And I heard him brag to a friend of his. He said, "You know how, no matter how hard I throw that to her, she'll catch it."
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, he just gave me one of the incentives of my life and one of the problems of my life. I never know how to get out of the way. I do think Dad especially gave me the impression that I could do what I wanted. I could play baseball if I wanted, or I could draw pictures if I wanted, you know.
I'm hoping you can go back a little bit on to your life as a journalist and talk a little bit about the perspectives on being a woman in this career. I'm a journalist here locally, and we've been able to share a few experiences on what happens with our work as females, or how we might be questioned when we submit work of equal quality to a male. And what does that look like? Has anything changed or evolved in your experience?
Hey, that's a good question. The perspective I've always had on writing is I am interested in public issues. And I would imagine, though I'm not sure, because I've never tried to write things on economic development because I don't really know as much about that. But I've always thought that seemed to be more of a male field, but that they, when they had more money, they hired me as a columnist.
Mm-hmm. Audrey, is it true that they would put your articles in the women's page?
Oh, well, not my articles, what I was doing at the time. You could have been tackling a whole issue. Like I was local president league, voters, state president league. Wow. So you'd be talking about something like zoning and some things like that. And you'd have a big meeting about it, and the reporting on it wouldn't end up on the state page or the front page. It would end up on a women's page. So it was all treated like women's news. So here's something about zoning alongside who had a party and who came to it.
Yeah.
You know, like who cares?
Yeah.
But you know, it really was getting a bit better. And I always have to attribute some of that influence that the women had at that time. See, most of us weren't working. Mm-hmm. And so you had quite a few women who had degrees and wanted an outlet for discussing and thinking about things that were not just family, but beyond family, or influencing family, education influencing family, health. There are all kinds of issues that influence family. So it wasn't as though it was either or, it was directly connected to family in many ways. Hey, coincidentally, they seem to have husbands who ran for the school board, the city council, the legislature. So then they'd go home and influence them.
Right.
And it's true, they called it something about bed communication.
Pillow talk.
There you go. I knew there was a better phrase for it.
I mean, today we have 24/7 news. And it seems to me like newspaper industry may be suffering a little bit. Do you have any insight as to that?
Well, I feel it's so deplorable that so much of it is not news.
Agreed.
And I really among other things, I think we need the newspaper because we need to be reading more in depth about things so that we get the entire picture. And maybe I'm wrong because I realize that people could read more in depth electronically, but I really wonder whether they do. That you may just read almost just like headlines.
Yeah,
And you're not,
scroll.
Yeah.
yeah, and you're not getting the full picture that you get when you've got, 40 inches on a story rather than 5 lines.
Right.
So I do worry about that. I really do think of the newspaper as the fifth estate, that it does watch elected people and what they're doing and public policy and what is going on. And short answer, I don't like what is passing as news. And then, of course, even more concerning is there are news media, huge news media, that really are mostly opinion rather than news. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So, Audrey, you've had such a wonderful career. You in state government and in politics. You've been very instrumental in some of the things that have happened in Wyoming throughout your career. What now, as a more mature woman, what do you see happening for women your age, or how would you advise people my age to continue to be involved?
I guess my philosophy is it's worth living at 93 as long as you stay engaged. And that means socially, but get it. Pay attention what's going on, and for goodness sakes, have enough gumption to get upset about it if it isn't working well or trying to contribute a little bit. So here's my philosophy: be sure you make friends with people that are under 65. So you can keep them for a while.
I agree.
Well, speaking of ages, you wrote your first book when you were 87 years old, which is impressive. What inspired you to do that?
Well, you're giving me too much credit. What I did was to take all those columns that I'd written and just publish them. So I really had been working on those for a while.
The title is so intriguing, though. A pinch of salt. What exactly do you mean by that?
I mean, you have to add to life in order to savor it, I guess is what I meant. Pinch of salts, savoring life in Wyoming.
So now more than ever, like you mentioned with e-news bombarding us, we have an access to a wealth of information that can guide or advise. And I'm curious what you would suggest for our viewers to make sure that the woman's voice and the woman's opinion or perspective, and it doesn't get drowned by all those other voices.
Yes, I think there are several issues that are very important to women, and they have to stay involved and they have to speak up. I think that women, because they're more conscious of some of the things that they have been deprived of in the past, I think they're really working on it now. I wasn't one of those women that marched all the time. I marched into that legislative office and told them what I thought ought to be done. So you need to speak up, and you need to be logical, and you need to say, no, I'm not just a bundle of what you thought was emotion. we're tender-hearted, but we're tough.
Mm-hmm. Well, unfortunately, Audrey, that's all the time we have for today's questions, but I know I have 1,000 more, and I'm sure our viewers have some questions as well. So we're going to include with this video some links and more resources where you can take one step further to learn about also your book, the Wyoming Humanities Council, and more. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Audrey. It was a pleasure speaking with you today.
Audrey, it was so nice to see you again.